In this video, we give an overview of NAT. Now, NAT stands for Network Address Translation. And just looking at the name, you can probably figure out exactly what NAT does. It translates one Layer 3 address to another Layer 3 address. And I know if you've not dealt with networks for a while, you might ask yourself, well, why on earth would you want to do that? I mean, come on, I've got a hard enough time just keeping up with one set of addresses. Now I have to keep up with a second? Well, let's explore what NAT is actually used for. NAT serves two basic functions. Number one, it allows machines in an RFC 1918 compliant network to connect to the internet. So you have a network full of machines that's on a 10.0 network or a 192.168 or any of the private IP address ranges. Obviously, you can't connect that directly up to the internet because just a few hops away from you, one of the internet routers is going to say, hey, that's a private IP address. I'm dropping it on the floor because you shouldn't be using these RFC 1918 addresses out on the internet. Network address translation allows you to keep your private IP addresses but still be able to get out to the internet. The second function NAT serves is it allows networks with overlapping IP address ranges to communicate with one another. Let's say you're a corporate administrator and the company you work for has just acquired another company. And let's say both of you use the 172.16.1.0/24 network for your corporate office. Well, obviously you can't just hook the two networks together because IP addresses will conflict and you've got routes built around certain addresses being on certain pieces of equipment, and it's just not a pretty sight to do that. I mean, yeah, you can make it work, but I mean, it's a headache. Trust me on this. Been there, done that. What you can do is put a NAT router in between the two networks, and you can define addresses on the remote network that translate to addresses on your network. So while their main file server might be 172.16.1.5, you can translate that to 172.16.1.3 on your network. Or more accurately, what you would do is you'd set up another network on the inside of yours that is not in either network range, and that's the address range that you'd use to NAT through to the new acquisitions network. Now, we won't do that at the CCNA level. That's more of an advanced topic, but those are the two functions of NAT. The most common use of NAT is to connect multiple internal machines to the internet. In fact, I would be willing to bet that if you have a high-speed internet connection at home, you're using NAT right now and may not even realize it. Now, there are three basic categories of NAT. The first is a static NAT. A static NAT is a one-for-one address mapping from the outside to the inside or the inside to the outside. Dynamic NAT allows for a pool of internal addresses to connect to the outside using a pool of outside addresses. And essentially, it's kind of like that static one-for-one NAT, except you don't have to manually configure it. So you can tell your NAT router, hey, anything on the 172.16.0.0 network, I want you to translate it outside to the 12.1.0.0 network. And the NAT router will just take care of that using dynamic NAT. The third and most common use of NAT is NAT overload, or what's called port address translation, or PAT. Port address translation allows multiple internal machines to connect through a smaller pool of addresses. Where dynamic NAT still requires an outside address to correspond to an inside address, NAT overload says you can have 65,534 addresses on the inside and one address on the outside, and it'll all work. Of course, that exact ratio won't work properly, but you get the drift. You can have 150 internal addresses and one outside address, and port address translation will take care of all that for you. Now, we touched on exactly how NAT and PAT works on the IC&D1 level, and I won't break out that wonderful little diagram again, but it will become a little more clear when we set it up at the IC&D2 level, because at IC&D2, we will be setting it up without using that wonderful SDM that we did in IC&D1. And we'll be able to directly validate on the iOS itself that our configuration works as expected. So one of the stated purposes of NAT is to reduce the number of registered IP addresses needed for an organization to connect to the internet. We'll talk a little bit more about IP address exhaustion when we talk about IPv6, but essentially if you have 722 machines on the inside of your network, you don't really need to have 722 public IP addresses. And many ISPs won't give you that many unless you have a very, very good reason. However, static NAT requires the same number of addresses on the outside as on the inside, so you might be thinking, well, that sort of defeats the stated purpose of NAT here. One advantage of static NAT is allowing you to filter traffic on the NAT router. So you've got this static NAT that says this address on the outside corresponds to this address on the inside, but I'm going to block everything except port 80 going through this NAT. You can do that with extended access control lists, and honestly, when you get to this level of filtering, you're starting to get into firewalling functions. And in my opinion, once you get to this level, you really need to have an actual firewall in place, like an ASA or a PIX, or any of the myriad hundreds of firewalls that are out there. The last statement we'll make is that dynamic NAT or port address translation is sometimes used as a security function. Essentially, if you don't have that one-to-one mapping from the outside to the inside, then the traffic can really only go one way, which is inside to out, and any replies come back through the same NAT function. That concludes our overview of NAT. Stay tuned for the lab where we set up all of these various flavors of NAT.